Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Minghella Building and the Department of Film, Theatre and Television. My name's John Gibbs, and I'm Head of Department, and I'm going to do a little double-headed introduction to this evening with my colleague Lucia Najib, who's the Director of the Centre of Film Aesthetics and Cultures. It's a particular pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Laura Mulvey, theorist, filmmaker, and Professor of Film at Birkbeck, on her first visit to the Minghella Building, but on a return to the department of which she was a member between 1979 and 1982, in her first post in higher education. In those days, before the merger which brought Bullmarsh College together with the University of Reading, we had a different name, Film and Drama, and a different location at Bullmarsh. But I hope Laura will feel strong continuities as well as appreciate changes. The teaching of theatre and film together, the integration of practice with critical, theoretical and historical approaches, the underpinning emphasis of close reading and performance analysis to everything that we do. Few scholars in any subject have so consistently produced illuminating and transformative interventions in the field. Visual pleasure and narrative cinema and her work on Douglas Sirk and melodrama in the 70s are landmarks in the development of film studies. The 90s saw, among other things, the publication of a monograph on Citizen Kane and fetishism and curiosity. In 2006, Laura published Death 24 Times a Second, a foundational text for the study of the digital in film. And then the edited collection the following year, British Experimental Television. As well as directing and co-directing films across this period, including 23rd of August 2008, which was selected for last year's Berlin Film Festival, Laura also had a key role in inspiring videographic criticism, with one of the first video essays, although that term wasn't current at the time, presented on the occasion of another of Laura's returns to Reading as keynote speaker in the Style and Meaning Conference in March 2000. Throughout, her work is characterised by the evocative and suggestive turn of phrase, the ability to move between a delicate grasp of material detail of films and wider theoretical ideas, the skills of a critic and the ability to overturn received ideas. It's a compelling combination. But before we get to hear Laura in action, I'm now going to hand over to Lucia, who's going to do the second part of the introduction.
Hi everybody, Lucia Najib is my name. I'm known to most of you here. Just a few announcements. This lecture is going to be followed by a wine reception. You are all cordially invited to join us afterwards in the celebration of this wonderful event. This lecture will also be followed by Q&A, and everything is being filmed, so please use the roaming mic when you ask your questions at the end. A few acknowledgements, obviously, to my dear colleague John Gibbs. We've been working together very closely in the organization of these events, which are organized by Cfac, but always counts with the unstinting support of the Department of Film, Theatre and Television. But I would like also in particular to thank Becky Hillman for her help in organizing this, Ellie Deering, who's behind the camera here, Chris Bacon, our fantastic technician, and the students Jack Lovegrove, Rachel Macmillan, and Josh Beavers, who are helping us with different parts of the technicalities here. Now, just a few words about Cfac, an acronym that stands for the Centre for Film Aesthetics and Cultures, a centre which is rapidly fulfilling its ambition to be a centre of international excellence in research and teaching of film. Cfac is a catalyst for expertise in film at the University of Reading, with members from different departments, schools and faculties across the university. Laura Mulvey today is our third public speaker, and these 3 public lectures were organized by Cfac, but this time in particular in partnership with the Department of Film, Theatre and Television, given the particular significance of our guest speaker to the origins and history of the department. Cfac is very keen to meet the aims established by the new research and international strategies being implemented at Reading. Our membership is growing with international PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. One of them, Dr. Igor Kristic, I think is here, who's in charge of Cfac's next big event, the conference World Cinema and the Essay Film, starting end of April and including several international keynote speakers and filmmakers. Another big event will be the workshop Disappearing War on 13th of April, jointly organized by Lisa Peirce and Christina Helmish, with a fabulous lineup of speakers as well. And so on and so forth. So stay in touch with us. Our website is www.readingac.ac.uk/Cfac, and write to me or to Igor if you want to be put down on our mailing list. Now, a few words about our guest, who doesn't need any introductions, but she's going to receive yet a second introduction now. Not just because she's the greatest film scholar in the world, but because we all love Laura Mulvey. We have all learned how gaze construction operates in the cinema thanks to her revolutionary feminist essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. John has already mentioned that, but also her afterthoughts on visual pleasure and narrative cinema. We all continued to worship Laura when she drew from Freud, psychoanalysis and Marx in order to explain to us the workings of fetishism and curiosity in the cinema in her book of the same name. And now we cannot stop quoting the pensive spectator and delayed cinemas developed in Death 24 Times a Second, her pioneering study of the effects of new technologies on the ways we experience film. But we love Laura Mulvey for sharing these jewels, as well as her extraordinary filmmaking, with us, with unparalleled generosity. Laura's attitude towards film theory has never been to impose, but to share, to create opportunities for new scholars. Laura is the best because she's the most open-minded person I've ever known. Traveling the world with her inseparable notebook, and today she has at least 4 notebooks in her handbag, where she takes notes of every phrase, every thought she hears at the endless conferences and events she attends, and often also organizes. And she then incorporates those little thoughts and ideas in her monumental edifice in honor of cinema, making them sound like the work of innumerable geniuses. Whether we come from close or from as far as Brazil, as I did, she will keep an open door for us. She will support us, because this is her politics. Laura Mulvey's feminism means democracy and solidarity, and she will never relent on this point. We all have a collective debt to Laura, and we cannot thank her enough. Max Ophüls has been one of Laura's long-standing passions, and today she reserves some new revelations about him. We can't wait to hear that. Thank you so much, Laura.
Well, it's very difficult to follow on from that. Though what I would like to say to begin my presentation this evening is that John was quite right. It all started for me, not actually physically here, but down the road at Bulmersh College, where I got my first regular job in higher education in the wonderful film and theatre department, which was extremely exciting moment for me. And I learnt so much from the way that Bulmersh organised its teaching. The principle of co-teaching, so that I worked alongside Doug Pye with such vivid memories of the classroom there at Bulmersh. And the way that Doug organised things was often not only by pairing lecturers, but also pairing directors. So we would do a Hollywood director alongside a European director, say Hitchcock alongside Renoir, Cirque perhaps alongside Visconti. Somewhere along the line there, I did Ophüls, and I have certain memories of working on one of Ophüls's Hollywood films, Court, in the Bulmersh days. But the other thing I just wanted to evoke from those days in Bulmersh was precisely, as John mentioned, the importance of textual analysis. And this involved a certain amount on my part of terror at the equipment. There was a very large 35mm editing table, which John just reminded me was called the Prevost, which stood at the back of the seminar room. And to make it work for our most extraordinary experience of actually doing textual analysis frame by frame with 35mm prints, in order to have that extraordinary treat, one had to take the film off its reels and put it onto cores. Nowadays, none of you will know what a core is, but it is a tiny little plastic thing on the top of which is a large 35mm film. The danger of the core dropping out and the whole film turning up on the floor, and the terror of this very, very large and frightening machine was actually compensated for by the enormous pleasure of doing literal frame-by-frame analysis. I actually was invited, Doug invited me to come to Bulmersh in 1979 because Victor Perkins, who'd founded the department, had just left for Warwick. So I came in as a stand-in for Victor, which was in itself a rather amazing experience. And Victor is possibly one of the people in the world who loves, I would acknowledge this, that he loves Ophüls more than I do. And rumour has it, or perhaps he even told me this when I last saw him, he's actually learning German so that he can read, do you corroborate this? Yes. That he's learning German so as to read Ophüls' autobiography in the original. Otherwise it doesn't exist. There are little bits of it here and there in Cahiers du Cinéma and so on. But you corroborate that Ophüls is Victor's. So, great love. So here I think I would kind of rather like to dedicate this lecture to the moment when I replaced Victor at Bulmersh, but also to his great passion for Max Ophüls. Now, my paper today, I'm a little bit anxious about it. As you can see, I was still kind of looking through my pages because I tried to put something together that was a little bit different from anything else I've done on Ophüls, rather for this special occasion. And so my presentation is in 3 parts. The first part, which I consider to be rather both unconventional and conventional in a way, is about Ophüls' own life and his own experiences with the cinema. In some ways, it's unconventional because the whole concept of thinking about biography alongside the text, as it were, disappeared out of film studies and criticism very much around the time when I went in the 70s, when to think about the actual aspects of a director's life was, in a sense, to undermine his place as a great auteur. So, in some ways, there's something old-fashioned and conventional about bringing back the director's life story, but I also like to think of it, in Ophüls' case, as something that's absolutely essential for understanding his films, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, he had a very up and down career, as I'm going to evoke in a moment. But also, he has an interestingly twisted and turned place in the history of film theory and criticism itself. And you might say that as film theory and criticism have changed over the years, you also see the place of Max Ophüls moving almost like a kind of signifier, a kind of what the kind of changing trends were. So originally, in the 1950s, he was taken up by the directors, by the critics of the Cahiers du Cinéma, who later became the directors of the Nouvelle Vague, and seen as one of the great stylists of cinema and one of the great auteur directors. Now, and they of course championed him in his very difficult later years, which I'll come back to later on. But then, by the time we get to the 70s, with the rise of feminist film theory, feminists claimed Max Ophüls for themselves as a director of the woman's film and as a master of melodrama. So these were the stories of romance, feminized narratives that were bound up with sexuality or the family, those films that privileged a female central character and very much addressed to a female audience. And I think around the 70s and 80s, perhaps into the 90s, you could say that work on critical writing on Max Ophüls just exploded, didn't it, John? You know, with Victor and a lot of feminist writing, and a lot of it concentrated on Letter from an Unknown Woman, which isn't a film that I'm going to be talking about this evening. And so he's a very much written about, very much discussed director, but very particularly adopted by feminist theory and feminist criticism. Now, my approach here is both generic and auteurist, and again, I realise that auteurism is also slightly unfashionable, but I feel that working with a director like Ophüls, it's almost impossible to avoid it. But I feel that Ophüls' relationship with melodrama is ambivalent. During his period in Hollywood, he never really settled into the studio system. His films were always somewhat aberrant, and he rarely, perhaps only with court, allowed the happy end to take over the film, as did, for instance, his fellow German exile, Douglas Sirk, who always emphasized the fact that the happy end was the mark of the melodrama, as well as the stamp of the producer and the front office, who felt that the happy end was an essentially American trope. But I want to make three initial points about the relevance of melodrama to Max Ophüls, and particularly in terms of La Signora di Tutti, which is going to be the main focus of my remarks this evening. Now, first of all, we all understand that the melodrama focuses on family, and La Signora di Tutti certainly belongs to the melodrama genre from this point of view. The melodrama is marked by its characteristic dramatis personae. It has a set of characters who come out of the nuclear family, father, mother, children, and out of this setting, out of this setting, the traumas and tensions around family relationships begin to congeal and cohere into a dramatic situation. So whether it's tensions between child and parent, between siblings, between mother and son, and so on, the melodrama makes clear the way that the family, the actual kind of hearth site of love between family members, is also the site of emotional tension and potential trauma. So these two things exacerbate one or another and develop into the kind of the melodramatic genre. And I think one of the things I think is interesting about La Signora di Tutti is that Gabi's family, for those, and I think most of you saw it this afternoon, that Gabi's family is doubled. She has her first biological family and then her adopted family, which I'll come back to. But the family is certainly there, and the tensions develop throughout the film between the relationship between the two sisters, the relationship between father and son, and Gabi moving from one family into another. Next, there's the question of gender. And as I pointed out earlier, we tend to think of the melodrama in terms of a central female character and the women's film. I have tended, in fact, my recent interest in Ophüls has really been out of his, to my mind, unparalleled reflections on questions of masculinity rather than femininity. And so the extended work that I've done on him recently has been around three films: Liebelei, made in 1932 in Germany, Letter from an Unknown Woman, made in 1947 in Hollywood, and Madame II, made in France in 1952, in which in all three films he creates contrasting iconographies of different kinds of masculinity, which is not my topic here, and I'm going to control myself and not go into it. But I do think that that question of gender and masculinity is very important in Letter from Freudian slip, La Signora di Tutti. Because here we see the doubling of the fathers, and when I get on to show you the clips, that's the point at which I'm going to start. But there's also the aesthetics of the melodrama. As any of you who will have seen this film of Ophüls or his others will know how much he was a master of the mobile camera, whether it was through tracks, crane movements. His camera, in a sense, almost has no sense of gravity. And it has a choreography which moves with a choreography of the characters. So in some sense, to use rather a cliched metaphor, there's a kind of ballet of character and a ballet of camera, which we'll also look at in one of the opening sequences of the movie. But also, and I think we become very aware of this in La Signora di Tutti, that melodrama is also a melos alongside drama. It's to do with sound and music, and the emotion of sound and music. And that's very key to the kind of central, pivotal point of Alma's death, which we'll look at in a moment. And going back to my early days at Bulmersh, where I learnt, and we learnt, how important the questions of mise en scène are in the cinema, and the way that lighting, camera movement, and so on is key to articulating any question of narrativity, character, or character interaction, but also how important the house is in the melodrama, the depiction of domestic space, the different topographies of the house. So those were the three opening points about the melodrama. But La Signora di Tutti is a hybrid film. On the one hand, we could say it was a melodrama, but on the other hand, its framing story is set in the film industry. And so this hybridity enables a reflection, a melodramatic story fused with a reflection on questions of the cinema, or perhaps more precisely, the female star as commodity within the film industry, and the relationship between her beauty and the mechanics of cinema, and how the two kind of work together, which to my mind is one of the extraordinarily interesting points about this film. So in the third part of my paper, I'll come back to that, and also alongside it, I'll introduce Ophüls' last film, Lola Montez, in which the same kinds of questions of the female star and her commodification are key. Now, first I want to say something about Ophüls' Europeanness. So I contend that Ophüls in his work and in his cultural outlook transcended national boundaries and was from the beginning and always remained a European. Now this is slightly controversial because it's been pointed out to me that however much I hold close to my heart this sense of internationalism associated with Ophüls, how important German culture and German traditions of German cinema were to him as well. But I still contend that this sense of Europe is there in his work. And it's due to his birth, due to his pan-European career in cinema, and also his struggle in Hollywood to preserve his own very European style. But also I think that the legacy of European modernism and internationalism that marked his generation in the 1920s continued to be a source of reference for him. So I now just want to expand these points a little bit. Ophüls was born Max Oppenheimer in 1902, and the first point of my sense of him as European was that he was born in the Saar, which is a small province of Germany which borders on France and sometimes belonged to France and moved backwards and forwards. So in a sense is almost essentially, Igor is nodding, essentially kind of mixed French and German. He was determined not to go into follow his father into business and to work in the theatre, and he apparently changed his name to Ophüls so as to avoid causing embarrassment to his deeply respectable parents. So I think there's something about his Jewishness and the geography of his birth that contributed to his ability to cross frontiers. But like so many others at the time, he left the provinces. Saar seemed to be very provincial, and was for the internationalist, intellectual, modernist milieu of Weimar Germany. Now, many years later, he worked with Georges Annenkopf, who was his costume designer on the 1950s films in France, who became his very close friend and his confidant. And Annenkopf published a short account of working with Ophüls, which begins with the story of how Ophüls insisted on a kind of cultural and artistic negotiation between them before he could imagine that they could work together. And they began with the Russian theatre where Annenkopf had worked with Meyerhold, and Ophüls cites Alexander Tyroff's book, The Theatre Unchanged, that had been translated into German and had influenced him when he worked in the German theatre. So one of them would offer Meyerhold, the other would then offer Tyroff. And then they would move through a long discussion mentioning key names so that they would understand each other's influences and where they came from. So, for instance, Max Reinhardt, Wedekind, Schnitzler, favourites of European literature, and then ending up with the greats of silent cinema. And then Ophüls exclaimed, "C'est parfait, notre langue commune est trouvée." It's perfect. We have found our common language. So there's that sense of kind of coming together around the kind of international modernism of the teens and the 20s, which was still important to Ophüls towards the end of his career in the 1950s. And also, just to return to his geographical origins, although the Saar might have seemed very provincial to him at the time, the first critic to write about Max Ophüls, Claude Berly, emphasizes the importance of his geographical origins and says, "C'est un homme du Rhin." He was a man of the Rhine, with all the historical, cultural implications that the geography of the Rhine carries with it. Now, Ophüls only really became interested in the cinema after it began to speak. Before that, he'd worked in the German theatre, going from city theatre to city theatre in a very similar way that Douglas Sirk did, ending up in Berlin with a successful enough career in the theatre to be able to move almost seamlessly into the huge production studios of Ufa. In 1932, he made Liebelei, which was a great success, and it should have been the beginning of a really important career in German cinema. But in the aftermath of the Reichstag fire, he realized, and he was told by his friends, that it was impossible for someone of a Jewish origin to stay in Germany any longer. So he, with his wife and his little son Marcel, just packed up, and without anything that they couldn't take with them on the train, left Berlin and moved to Paris. Eventually he became a French national, but he worked until the fall of France in 1941, in France, in Holland, and then with this one wonderful exception in Italy with La Signora di Tutti in 1934. But when, after the German invasion and occupation of France, Ophüls had to move again. He'd made broadcasts for the French army, propaganda broadcasts into Germany in German, denouncing Hitler, which had been very popular and made quite a big, had attracted quite a lot of attention. And so once again, he had to pack up and leave, doing the famous journey with his wife and son across the Pyrenees, through Spain, into Lisbon, and getting on the road out of Lisbon and arriving in New York. Now, a lot of stories about this, which I can't actually go into now, because I want to talk about the film. But I just wanted to say, as a point of interest, that his son, Marcel, recounts his father's commitment to a united Europe, how much he loved the idea of Europe, and also how he refused to blame Germany for Hitler. and how he used to argue with the other exiles when he was in Hollywood. Marcel says, "My father and his friend Fred Kortner were always getting into fights with other Hollywood Jews. Both believed that Goethe and Schiller shouldn't be held responsible for Hitler." By this time, there were too many European exiles looking for too few jobs in Hollywood, and he didn't manage to direct for 4 years, and when he did, he had a hard time. He insisted, as far as possible, on shooting with his famous fluid style, with complicated setups and his beautiful crane movements. And these were not only kind of resisted on a practical term by many of the production team in Hollywood, but particularly the editor that he worked with, Ted Kent, who felt that this way of working was Germanic and un-American. This wasn't the way in which the American people understood cinema. And I just wanted to have a quick quotation from assistant director Ben Chapman. "Max went into some of these tremendous gyration shots that are very typically German. He liked to get on a crane and wander all around the place. He liked to do 100-foot dolly shots and dolly track shots, and waving his hands in the air and that sort of thing. That's just gilding the lily. That's how pictures became so expensive. When you have a director like Max, and he has a German attitude and a German way of shooting things well, that's when you get hurt. A good commercial director doesn't do that." But I think it's important to remember this, because in some ways La Signora di Tutti is almost the kind of crucible out of which that amazing style emerged. I just wanted to talk about his end of his life. He returned to France and made 4 films in the early 50s, and then he died in 1957 after he'd made Lola Montez, which some people consider to be his masterpiece. And once again, he was directing, back in Germany, for the theatre, a production of Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro in Hamburg. And I'm going to come back to Lola, so it's important just to put it in place here. As his first colour and widescreen film, he really struggled with Lola Montez. He wanted it to be his masterpiece, and his colleagues at the time felt that he, Ophüls, intuited that this would be his last film. And Jacques Nathanson, his screenwriter, gives this description of how Ophüls was wounded by the film's disastrous critical and box office failure. He said, "Obviously Max was hoping to create a masterpiece. He was inspired, possessed. Should I have told him? Should I have held him back? Was I wrong? Doubtless I was, because of the brutality of stupid critics. The general public was scared away." Ophüls was mortally wounded by this blow. With a sad smile, he said, "I'll get my revenge in 20 years in the cine clubs." And then, retrieving his ability to laugh, he added, "Unfortunately, I'll be dead by then." Unlike the critics, he could see the future. But fate didn't give him 5 years to see his prophecies fulfilled. It only gave him 2. So there's a sense in which it's thought that Lola Montez, in some sense, kind of hastened his death at the age of 55. And there's an extraordinary kind of tragedy to that premature ending. But to think that he had to remake his life, first starting in Ufa, totally remaking from scratch in Hollywood, and then starting again in Paris, and ending with his masterpiece dismissed by critics and audience as to such an extent. Victor said, someone has said that when it lasted for about a week in the cinema, and the management tried to steer the audience out by a side entrance from in the cinema, so that those waiting to come in wouldn't hear the dismissive comments. Anyway, it was a disaster, and it contributes to his death. Now, I want to talk about the melodrama in La Signora di Tutti. As I said at the beginning, Gabi, who's our central female character, whose story the film tells, has her own biological family. She and her sister Anna, their mother has died, and they live with their rather tyrannical father, Il Colonnello, who represents the army, the patriarchy, and the kind of strictness of the bourgeois family. And as those of you who've seen it, I'll just say for those of you who don't, the film starts with a scandal when Gabi has one of the teachers at her school has fallen in love with her, and she's expelled. And this is the scene with her father, her aunt, who's the housekeeper, and her sister Anna. And I want you to see two things here. One, the characterization of the father, which is the main point. Two, the way that Ophüls shoots the scene, so that the drama that's going on, the confrontation with the father, before he calls Gabi in, is only heard on the soundtrack. And we see Gabi wandering slowly and sadly up and down the corridor. Can we just see the first one, Josh? So I think it's very clear there that a particular iconography of the father is being established. And I don't need to go into it because I think the extract makes it very clear. And the emphasis on the army, on the colonnello, the daughter of an army officer and so on, puts the father very much on one side of a particular kind of patriarchal masculinity. Now, I just want to go straight on and see, because I want to kind of see these two iconographies together. So if Gabi is invited to the house of the Nanni family, who are rich bourgeois, and she's kind of adopted by the invalid Alma, who's the mother of Gabi's admirer, Roberto, who's actually gone away to Rome to study. So during this whole period, we've had a beautiful kind of adopted mother, adopted daughter relationship between Alma and Gabi. And then this happens. And so as I see it, we have the contrasting iconography of the adoptive father, who is the exact opposite of the colonnello. He's the easy, seductive, erotic father who obviously is going to fall in love with Gabi and him and her with him. So to a certain extent, we have a displaced Oedipal relationship here, as the daughter-father relationship becomes an eroticized one out of the complete, out of the severity of the iconography of the first father. So I just wanted to get that kind of dialogue between the two of them there, and to think about the way in which this lack of, as Gabi constantly says, I don't have a mother, and so out of this home in which there was no love, she comes into the Nanni household and moves from her close relationship with her adopted mother into this love affair with what I think of as her adopted father. So there's a kind, as I said earlier, just to reiterate, there's this kind of Oedipal tension at this point. And I just want to carry straight on. But first of all, I want to think about the way in which the staircase becomes such a key figure. It's a topographical figure. The staircase in our poetics of space, as it were, is an in-between, a threshold. It's neither one thing nor the other. It's neither the upstairs, the private space of the bedrooms, nor is it completely the public space of the downstairs entertaining area. So in that sense, you could say it's uncertain, in between, and signals a kind of danger. And it's interesting the way that Gabi, as she goes up the stairs, if you notice, she slips and stumbles a tiny bit, and in her beautiful long dress, and Leonardo kind of catches her and picks her up. But the way he shoots the staircase is also extremely beautiful. And he's not the only director. There are many directors who've made the most of the place of the staircase as a site of strange encounters, but also as a site of kind of cinematic potential. And then, of course, in the crucial scene of Alma's death, the staircase returns. And I'm going to show you that now. And this time it's important to remember the actual place of the melos within drama, and how the music of the radio, which was specially composed for the film, actually articulates the emotion of the scene. So you'll all have noticed, I'm sure, that where Alma lands and where she dies is the precise point on the stairs where Leonardo and Gabi had actually first met. And this comes back in a third time, which really draws our attention to the way that Ophüls uses mise en scène, but also, as so many of his critics and commentators have pointed out, how he also works with repetition. And in this sense, the repetition of the site then immediately says something to the spectator. When something is repeated, it accumulates the meanings that it had earlier, and in this sense kind of poignantly displaces and changes them. And here in the final staircase sequence, we see these resonances and connotations coming together. So I just wanted you to notice there the way that Ophüls uses repetition and uses the particular point on the staircase to bring out the kind of poignancy of the three moments there. Now I must move on, because I want to move on to my third part of my paper. And this is the question of the film industry and the way that it's depicted in La Signora di Tutti. The film is adapted from a novel, which I've never actually been able to find, and which was acquired by Alberto Rizzoli, who was a newspaper magazine kind of tycoon of the time, who wanted to move into pictures and had greatly admired Libellai, which he'd seen, and he went out of his way to invite Ophüls to come and shoot the film in Italy. And just as many people have pointed out, there's a sense it's worth noticing that it was very easy for Ophüls to go and work in fascist Italy as a Jewish director, which would have not been possible in Germany. But what I'm interested in here is the way that Ophüls deals directly with the film industry, and particularly with the fabrication and the marketing of this beautiful young woman, Gabi Doriot. who's played by Isa Miranda, who was discovered, in fact, for this film. She'd actually had a part in another film which had not been a success. And so it was really La Signora di Tutti that put Isa Miranda on the map. And the film, when it was finished, was shown successfully and won some prize at the Venice Film Festival. Now, from my point of view, this is a really extraordinary demonstration of how the figure of the woman and the beautiful female star is used as a commodity in which the cinema invests and to turn her into spectacle, and how she then circulates as a commodity and as a point of attraction that sells the movie to its public. But I think the opening sequence of the film, in which the record Io sono la signora di tutti is being played on the gramophone, while her agent and the producer argue over her terms, establishes this as one of the topics that interested Ophüls, as it were, alongside the melodrama, and to my mind perhaps even more than the question of the melodrama. So this is the next sequence, but I just want to say a couple of things before we go on to that. I mean, one of the things I think is so remarkable about that opening scene is the economy, the way that Gabi is signified by her voice and the record, and the way in which the negotiation between the agent and the producer literally reduces her to an object of bargaining. But it also reminds us of the way in which the figure of the star, the figure of the beautiful woman who's going to be projected onto the screen, is also in some sense a mask which is concealing the squalid background negotiations on which the cinema actually depends, and out of which it emerges and on which it depends. And there's a way in which Ophüls, and throughout the film, we won't see the scenes where all the team of the backroom production are collected together, in which Ophüls seems to have kind of brought a whole set of caricatures of the most unsavory and unappealing male figures together, who are going to be then, as it were, concealed and masked by the figure of the beautiful woman, who will actually, as they emphasize all the time, who they'll be marketing and who will actually make the films, mediate between them and the public. So there's a sense right there at the very beginning of what a commodity is, almost in Marxist terms, that behind the beauty of the commodity, which is desired by the public, lies this rather squalid process of commerce and labour and everything that, in a sense, has to be concealed, disavowed, for the commodity to emerge into the desiring public. So, in that sense, the woman is the pivot between the desire and the commodity, which is underlined by the film's title, Io sono la signora di tutti, and by the negotiations between the two men. And then once again, the way in which she, Gabi, the single individual person, represented metonymically by the record and her song, is then reproduced over and over and over again in the process of mechanical reproduction as the posters emerge from the printing machine. And here, again, is emphasized the star's relation to mechanical reproduction and to circulation. And Marianne Doane, the feminist theorist writing about La Signora di Tutti, has pointed out the woman becomes the exemplary work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And this mechanical repetition of her name on the posters then leads on to the repetition of her name over and over again in the studio sequence, which I'll show you now. And I'm showing you the studio sequence partly because of this kind of emphasis on the star and her name, but also it's one of the sequences where you see Ophüls' camera really exploding into movement and picking up the movement, as I said earlier, the kind of choreography of the people and the extras and the choreography of the camera. And Ophüls himself, talking about this film, gives a lot of credit to the cameraman, who's called Udobaldo Arato, for having the courage, he said, to kind of take the camera and make it do these extraordinary things. So, having just had the scene of negotiation and squalor, in some sense, to my mind, the next sequence shows something of what the camera can actually do, and its beauty and its magic. I wanted you to see the way that Ophüls moves the camera just through the walls without caring for any kind of verisimilitude in order to keep that wonderful sweep forwards and then kind of sweep back. But also, I just wanted to point out the way from the very first moment with the gramophone, he's also interested in the gadgets of the modern and modernity. And the telephone recurs as an image throughout the film. And as we see there, and we saw the scenes with the radio, and Ophüls kind of makes that kind of communication environment very, very clear, and it's there, as it were, locating the cinema as one other medium of modern communications among the others. But then the scene of the star who's near to death then takes me forward to Lola Montez, where once again the film revolves around the figure of a star who's near to death. In the case of Lola Montez, as you might know, she was a celebrity, as we'd say nowadays. She might have been the first celebrity of the modern world, just famous for her romances and her affairs, the kind of person who would be highlighted by the popular press today, and we could think of examples. But in Lola, in the film, her sexual value has in a sense been exhausted. She's now old, and the ringmaster has decided to exploit her commercial value as a celebrity, and he uses her as an attraction to bring the audience into the circus tent. So I want to show you the opening where we first see Lola appear in the tent, and then I want to show you the last scene of Lola Montez, and then I think I'll make some final remarks, and it'll be time to wind down. Just to introduce the sequence, I told you already that Lola Montez was the first film that Ophüls made in widescreen and colour, which were conditions on the part of the key production company when they made the film. So that came, as it were, without question. And also without question was the figure of Martine Carole, who was a top movie star in France at the time, in the 50s, but was famous mainly for her cleavage rather than for her acting abilities. Now, I want to say a word about performance here. Both Martin Carol and Isa Miranda have been criticized for their very wooden performances, for the fact that wooden performances, let's just put it like that. But I think there's something, a way in which Ophüls uses these qualities and this kind of immobile appearance in both movies to say something about the woman as commodity and the woman as object of exchange. And I think when we see Martin Carol first carried into the tent in a moment in Lola, you will see the way that Ophüls has used her immobility of both expression and body to create what I think of as a rhetorical figure that represents something out of which life is being drained. Now, when she's carried on, the image of the woman dressed in gold being carried on this kind of thing. She reminds me rather of life-sized plaster or wooden statues of the Virgin, which might be carried through the streets of southern Europe on a feast day. And so just notice the way in which she's dressed, her immobility, and then how Ophüls cuts to this rather extraordinary close-up. And then we'll go straight on to the end of the film. And at the end of the film, you have to understand that throughout, the ringmaster has been promising the men in the audience that for $1, they'll be able to kiss the hand of this notorious woman. So although La Signora di Tutti ends with Gabi dying, they can't resuscitate her after her suicide. Lola Montez ends with Lola, in a sense, near death, and with this death-defying plunge. But in actual fact, it ends with this dramatic enactment of commodification, as though the film was asserting this actual abstract theme at the end, as the men in the audience come forward to pay $1 to kiss her hand as she's displayed like an animal in the wooden cage, and which seemingly shows the endless stream of undifferentiated male spectators, the mass audience for which this eroticized entertainment will never stop. And I feel there's some kind of balance between, or symmetry between the opening scene of La Signora di Tutti, made all those many, many years earlier in Italy in 1934, with the agent and the producer bargaining over Gabi's record, and this scene at the end made in France in 1955, coming back to the whole question of the commodification of the woman in a spectacle. So both Lola Montez and La Signora di Tutti deal with these relations between the entertainment industry and the financial structures on which it depends, which is personified in Lola by the figure of the ringmaster, and in La Signora di Tutti by the agent and the producer, and so on. Now, there's a moment, there's a point in Deleuze, I think it's the movement image actually, I can't remember which volume it is exactly, where he talks about films that are made about films, which suggest that their representation of money brings time to the fore, because in the cinema, time is money. He says, what the film within the film expresses is this infernal circuit between the image and money, this inflation which time puts into the exchange. The film is movement, but the film within the film is money, is time. The crystal image thus receives the principle which is its foundation, endlessly relaunching exchange, which is dissymmetrical, unequal, and without equivalence, giving image for money, giving time for images, converting time, the transparent side, and money, the opaque side, and spinning like a top. And the film will be finished when there's no money left. And so I've been arguing that in La Signora di Tutti and then again in Lola Montez, Ophüls dramatizes this question of image for money around the figure of the woman and posits the figure of the woman as the essential circuit through which money moves and then becomes film. So although Deleuze doesn't mention the figure of the woman, something that he's not particularly interested in any of his volumes, it seems very clear that her body and her body attracts the money, and then her image then circulates it. So this actuality of the body exchanged into money materializes in the virtual image on the screen, or the circus ring, which is there as a kind of proto-cinematic entertainment. But in this version of Time is Money, the flaw and the lack of equivalence, the ultimate collapse of the circuit, is expressed through the woman's ultimate resistance, which actually ends up with her death. So in a sense, it's almost as though the only way she can break the circuit is through death. And I think this becomes very clear in both the films. And finally, when the ringmaster forces Lola to take the huge dive, it's his ultimate gamble. He has to deliver the spectacle of the risk of death, but at some point, sooner or later, Lola, who they say very explicitly, her heart is worn out, will be no longer there, and there'll be no more money left. I just want to end by saying something coming back to the question of the performance and the image of the woman, and the way in which both these actresses have been criticized for their immobile performances and their, what people say, inability to act. But it seems to me that this immobility itself evokes the figure of the automaton as a kind of a figuration for the cinema itself. So if we take the image of the woman through whose body and through whose image the money will circulate, there's also a relationship, a displaced relationship to her as a kind of the beautiful mechanical automaton that acts for a figure of the film machine itself. And it seems to me that Ophüls, at the beginning of his career with La Signora di Tutti, and at the very end with Lola Montez, reflects on the mechanisms of the cinema that he loved so much, and also on the subordination of its stars to the very mechanisms of the industry and the market that produced them, and ultimately, perhaps, produce his own cinematic compulsion to repeat. So while Lola's mask-like features conceal the ravages of her illness, and I said earlier that Gabi's mask-like beauty conceals the actual squalor of the production system that lies behind her, the suggestion of a lifelike machine condenses with that of human mortality. And here, both Lola and Gabi perhaps sum up the uncanny nature of the cinema, the still frames of the celluloid strip are mechanically animated into an illusion of life, so its ghostly human inhabitants seem to keep alive, endlessly repeating the gestures of life long after the death of the originals. That's all.
Thank you, Professor Mulvey. It falls to me on the behalf of this public audience, colleagues, friends, to thank you for what has been not only a riveting lecture, but one which has been exquisitely articulated, beautifully constructed. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions in the audience. But there are so many strands you've shown us, not least the one of these repetitions which occur not only within the poetic space of the films, but also across the whole life of Ophüls, which you've revealed to us with such startling clarity. So I invite you to come back, and I invite the audience, please, to enjoy this possibility of asking questions now to our public speaker.
I think we have around 15 minutes for questions, not very long. So please raise your hands. John?
One of your lovely insights there, Laura, was into the different types of men in the film. The aggressive military male figure and the more sensitive, softer male figure. And immediately one can think of some of those other characters in the other films you mentioned you've been writing about, say Madame de, and Letter from a Woman, Leave I Too.
Exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Except I think what's I think is perhaps particularly interesting in this case is that they're father figures, whereas in Liebelei and in Letter and in Madame de, the opposing iconographies are between lover and husband. So there again, there's the figure of the patriarchy who's caricatured by his relationship with the military. And it's probably not fair to talk about this because other people won't have seen the films. But if you think of De Sica's performance next to Charles Boyer's performance, and how stance and position, everything brings out that opposite characterization. So I was interested in the fact that in La Signora di Tutti, he displaces this iconography onto the two father figures, which makes it in a sense almost more, it makes it Oedipal in a way that it isn't quite so in the other films. But I also think that that contrast is there in Ustinov, in The Ringmaster, who's at one of the same time is the cruel ringmaster, but he's also completely infatuated with Lola, and at the end says, "You know, if you died, I couldn't live without you." So he's both characters in one.
The difference there is that in Letter on a Woman and Madame de, there's a gap, isn't there, between the actor and the character Leonardo in this film and the rather more charming embodiments of that figure played by De Sica and Louis Jourdan. And I was wondering if because he seems to be a slightly bumbling, slightly less successful vision of that kind of masculinity. And of course he also has the son coming along who in some ways might be a more compelling figure. I'm perhaps not the best judge of these things, but is there an interesting kind of gap between the embodiment of the role and the kind of role in the sensitive male figure in this movie?
I should have mentioned Roberto because after Alma's death, there's the very poignant scene when Roberto says to his father, "You know, I've always wanted to marry Gabi, and this is the moment when I'm going to ask her." And Leonardo just says, "No, no, no." And that's it. And then, of course, Roberto comes back at the end. But I've seen that more in terms of kind of Roberto, Leonardo. I see more in terms of the conventions of the melodrama genre, of the way in which family relations, these family relations actually entwined, as it were, throughout the film, and that it turns out at the very end that Roberto has married Gabi's sister Anna, and it's that, in a sense, that causes her suicide. So I think the Leonardo Colonello stands, but Roberto, it seems to me, to belong more to the traditional melodrama. I mean, Leonardo, again, is a kind of complex figure as a performer. Now I can't remember. I've forgotten the name of the actor. I'm so sorry. I know it perfectly well. Just after giving a lecture, sometimes one can blank. But he was a theatre actor, and the scene which I didn't show you because we were running out of time is one of the most beautiful sequences when he's completely down and out and goes into the foyer of the cinema, and there's a 360-degree pan as Leonardo goes around looking at all the pictures of Gabi, and the song is on the soundtrack. And it's slightly overdone, it's slightly caricatured, but there's a way in which his cigarette, he's still got his cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth, but it's an amazing way in which, when he first appears, the cigarette is a sign of his kind of energy and his power and his masculinity, as it were, but at the end it's a sign of his down and outness, that he's now just a tramp who's just come out of prison for having embezzled all of his money and spent it on his wife. So I think that transition in the character of Leonardo is something very particular to this film, which I think is wonderful. But again, you know, the performance might seem a bit kitsch nowadays.
I wasn't looking at the performance, merely just that these scenes are less to embody these characters.
Yeah. I mean, he's not Charles Boyer by any means, or Vittorio De Sica by any means whatsoever.
Hello, I was fascinated by how many of the things you spoke about can be directly applied to Liebelei, in particular the point about the woman as commodity and an object of exchange, and but also relating to what you said about drama, melodrama, and music.
About what?
Ophüls' interest in drama and melodrama, and also the use of mellows, music.
Yeah.
Because of course in the Schnitzler play there is critiquing of the sweet girl, the süße Mädchen phenomenon of the upper class, men being allowed to have affairs with the lower class woman, and then gets away scot-free if she falls pregnant or anything happens to her. But also interesting how the in Liebelei, Schnitzler moves away from the stricter naturalism and the very strict social critiquing in the Schnitzler play. And in the film, he opens up the possibility, even though it's ultimately impossible because they're constrained by their conditions, but the possibility of a lasting union between Fritz and Christel, which is to do with Fritz's masculinity. And there's all the anecdotes about Ophüls, how Ophüls cast the actor because he had such a softly spoken voice, even though he was Northern German, so he didn't expect him to be so softly spoken, and then cast him. But I think I wanted to draw your attention to that shift, if you like, towards love, which in the Schnitzler play, at the moment where Fritz comes to visit Christel to tell her that he's going to take leave for a while, they won't be seeing each other for a while, and he notices in her room a painting, and she says, oh, it's a girl, she's looking out of the window, and it's winter. How Ophüls, he may or may not, but taking that motif of the winter and then translates it to the sleigh ride, where they have that moment of a loving union, which is of course the scene that is then repeated, as you've also mentioned in the other films, right at the end of the film after Fritz is killed. In the duel, so forth, there's like a wonderful convergence in early Ophüls of all the things that you've explored in La Signora di Tutti.
Yes, I think they come back almost more in, they come back in That's Non in Woman. Liebelei is such a is such a strange case because it seems to me, although Ophüls took those motifs that you're describing, he also, that because the time was so different from Schnitzler's time, he changes them, to my mind, politically. I mean, there's always the question of Ophüls' ambivalent relationship to love, because in some ways, I think he has an almost feminist sense of love being destructive to women. I mean, the women who die of love in Letter from an Unknown Woman and Madame Deux, and Christine a bit there. But I mean, again, this is a slightly different discussion, because it seems to me that making Liebelei in the early 30s in Germany, he was more interested in trying to make a message of pacifism than a message about trans-class relationships. So Christine is turned more into rather than just being a caricature of the Süße Mädel's sentimentality and her romantic belief in her love. I think it's more the importance of Fritz's softness next to the man, and the fact that Ophüls changes the gentleman, Schnitzler's gentleman, into a aristocratic military man. He's kind of saying that military-industrial complex, as we put it nowadays, that was dominant in the end of in the Habsburg period, is coming back now. And so I think the anti-duel pacifism scenes changed the story round a bit. And Ophüls is actually kind of indicating something of the coming threat of Nazism. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Because the changes that he made were so radical. Then, of course, he does it again with Letter from an Unknown Woman and again with Madame Deux.
Interesting, and also again the casting of Gustav Gründgens as the military
Yes.
count, and of course he's the head of the criminals ring in M.
Oh, yes, of course, yes, that's true.
He's wearing black.
But he's amazing. I mean, he actually manages, I mean, if we're talking about slightly caricatured performances, what's he called, Gustav Gründgens?
Yes.
Yes. He kind of epitomizes, I mean, if you put him next to the Colonnello in La Signora di Tutti, you see a complete continuity there of the obsessive patriarchal military man.
I would like to ask a question. Laura, I was really impressed with the recurrence of the music as the characters looking for the motivation of the music within the diegesis and not finding, looking behind the fireplace. And obviously in those days they were doing all sorts of experiments with sound being a big novelty in the cinema. Fritz Lang, as she was saying, was doing all sorts of things in M and so on. But in this film it seems that the extra diegetic music is focused on as if it was a maddening thing, something that you should get rid of, something that drives you mad, and unless the music is motivated within the story, it doesn't make sense and should be simply abolished. That's because it's so terrible. Even when the two guys at the beginning of the film are talking over the sound of the record, you just say, "Can you please stop that music? It's something that is so intrusive and so superfluous, so to say. It doesn't have any point to be there." Even when they go back and put the record again there, you just say, "No, please stop that." So I just want to, Am I reading too
Well,
much?
I don't know. I think you're so. I mean, I'd never thought of that about the fireplace and the haunted music and the haunting. But I mean, one of the things about La Signora di Tutti is that it is so well Libelli as well. I mean, the experiments with sound are extraordinary, and using a mixture between, because as Libelli starts in the opera. So there's a lot of play with music and sound, and then there's the telephone again, and so on. But to think of that scene as a rejection of extra-diegetic music is something that never occurred to me. So I think that's very witty. It might well be that where is this music coming from? It's just a haunting.
Of course, Hitchcock has done a lot of that in Vertigo. Where is that music? And then they discovered that it's playing there in that scene with James Stewart trying to go up the stepladder and.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he also finds
the music irritating.
Yeah, the source of the music that we had thought it was extra diegetic.
Yes.
And in the end, we find the source there. So,
right. Yes. No, I think that's a wonderful idea. That's never occurred to me before. But I mean, there's so much in a way that's unknown, and I don't know whether Victor is working on this or not. But I mean, if someone could do some proper research into Ophüls' experience in the theatre for all those years, when he worked, about 4 or 5 different German theatres, it would be very interesting to think about the relationship between mise en scène, sound, music, and so on. And a lot of his, it seems to me that it must be the case that a lot of his cinema, although transformed for the camera, must also have its roots aesthetically in some ways in his experience with theatre. Same with Douglas Sirk, I suppose. They both had very parallel careers in a way. But I'd love to know more about those because he must have worked in the theatre from the kind of early 20s right through to 1932.
You mentioned camera movement as a Germanic style. I find the camera movement fascinating because you were describing how it goes through walls, creating the artificiality of the space, whereas other directors are using camera movement to create a kind of reality of space. Can you talk a bit more about your feelings about why he's moving the camera so much, what Ophüls is trying to achieve in it? I'm also quite interested in, you were just talking about his theatrical background. I kind of find it very interesting when you have a theatre director moving into cinema who wants to break space.
I mean, to tell the truth, I don't know that we can really be able to understand about his use of camera until we know more about his theatre. He does have some beautiful camera in Libelli, but it's really in La Signora di Tutti that it kind of explodes, and he puts it down. He mentions the cinematographer Udobaldo Arato, who I mentioned earlier, as someone who had such extraordinary courage to move the camera. But I mean, there are moments, for instance, like when Gabi is just walking down the corridor while her father is shouting and stops and caresses the dog and then picks up the tray again. There's something very kind of cinematic about the way that he can take the time to pause and just allow the cinematic image to evolve. But I don't know if this is really relevant to what you're saying, but I mean, it seems to me that in many ways, one of the reasons why I love La Signora di Tutti so much is because it seems to me that it does make us think about how Ophüls both saw the cinema as an art and as a work of extraordinary beauty, which he invested in the camera and the magic of the camera, but at the same time understood that it had to be commerce, and it had to come out of commodity culture. something that he found, I think, quite difficult to reconcile. And but also, when he finally got to Hollywood and finally did have the best technicians and the best technology in the world, although he had such fights with the appalling editors who were always trying to shave off his shots and shave down the beginning and the end and break them up with cutaways, he found the actual mechanism of the cinema in Hollywood the best that he'd ever encountered. Though actually his cinema in Madame de and Lola Montez at the end of his life in Paris is really amazing as well. But this will just give me the chance to read the famous James Mason. You know this, John, don't you?
Indeed.
After Ophüls made several films, 2 films with James Mason, Reckless Moment and Court. And by this time, Ophüls was known for his style. And at the wrap party for one of the movies, Court, I think probably, James Mason had written this little kind of, you wouldn't call it a poem, what do you call it?
Ditty. Ditty?
Ditty? Good, yes. So he said, I think I know the reason why producers tend to make him cry. Inevitably they demand some stationary stat-ups, and a shot that does not call for tracks is agony for poor old Max, who, separated from his dolly, is wrapped in deepest melancholy. Once when they took away his crane, I thought he'd never smile again. Very good.
Perhaps this is the perfect note for us to wrap up now and give you some respite, Laura. Wonderful lecture. We couldn't give you that.